Hey everyone, and welcome to another weekly art video. I hope you're having an amazing day, and thanks so much for joining me on this one. I love Halloween, and I wanted to make sure that I created a Halloween-inspired tutorial for you before the month ended. So today I'm going to be sharing my entire drawing process, starting with my freehand preliminary pencil sketch and moving on to pen and ink techniques for this spooky abandoned old cabin pen and ink piece. Drawing houses and buildings is such a great way to continue practicing our 3D forms and perspective, which are art fundamentals and are such an essential part of drawing. And another thing that we're going to be practicing by working on this piece is we're going to be using a reference photo as a loose source of inspiration in order to bring in a certain level of realism into our piece, but at the same time, we're going to be bringing in our artistic license to change things up, to bring things in, to remove things in order to make this old cabin spookier and to make this piece our own. All right, so without much further ado, let's go ahead and jump straight into this drawing process. All right, you guys, so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a preliminary, very basic sketch using a simple graphite pencil before moving on to my pen and ink. Why? Because I want to make sure that I am utilizing my drawing space effectively. My drawing is not too small or not too big in the page, that it is relatively centered. And I also want to make sure that my sketch shows believable perspective, 3D form, and also proportions are where I want them to be before moving on to the pen and ink. This way I can move on to the pen and ink process with more confidence and more looseness and move more quickly, which is going to help me arrive at greater line weight variation, and I can just know that I am stemming from a solid foundation. So it's just the way that I like going about it. And as with every other drawing process that I go through, whenever I am sketching anything, there are 3 things that I make sure to have in mind for greater success and for my process to go more smoothly. And these 3 things are: I always make sure to start my drawing out lightly so that I can refine my drawing, erase mistakes, make any corrections as I go. 2, I always make sure to simplify everything that I'm looking at into basic shapes or forms. And 3, I always make sure to work from general largest shapes or forms and work towards the smaller shapes, smaller forms, smaller details. Work from general and make your way towards specifics. That is really helpful with getting proportions right. I would recommend, before jumping into the freehand sketching process, to take some time to observe that reference photo, notice the different forms that are making up this compound structure. And all a compound structure is it's a combination of separate simple forms. And what I mean by that is you can see the bottom base section or portion of this cabin as being a rectangular prism. And the roof portion can be a triangular prism that is sitting on top of that rectangular prism. And then we have the entrance portion that is definitely a smaller structure that is adjacent or attached to that base structure, which also can be simplified as a rectangular prism, even though it's an open area. And the upper section, the little roof above that entrance, can also be simplified as a triangular prism. The chimney is nothing but a rectangular prism as well. And I know that steps and stairs can also be something challenging and intimidating to draw, but I will be giving you my process or hack that I like using in order to simplify this. Now, what makes this challenging is we're seeing this cabin from a certain vantage point, from a certain perspective. So I want you to notice what planes you're able to see for these structures that you're going to be drawing. The term plane in art is simply a fancy way of saying sides of a structure. Notice the different sides that you're able to see. Now, as with all other drawings or paintings that I create, stemming from a reference photo, I am going to bring in my artistic license a ton. I am going to remove things. I am going to add things. I know even at this point, for example, that I'm going to be removing that little section of the roof that is popping out right above the triangular roof portion of the entrance. I'm also going to be adding dry trees to make this more creepy. I'm going to be adding a wooden post fence around the house. I'm going to be removing the hill or mountain that is behind the cabin and adding things if I want to change the mood and make this a little bit more spooky, especially for Halloween. Let's go ahead and jump into our drawing. This is a B grade drawing pencil, by the way. Usually, if I were creating a drawing for myself, I would be using something like an HB pencil to make sure I'm keeping it as light as possible. But because I want you to be able to see what I am doing, I'm going with a slightly softer pencil grade. The first thing that I like doing when I am drawing an outdoor scene is just establishing the horizon line, which is our eye level as the viewer of the scene. And I'm drawing it lightly because I'm going to be erasing a good portion of it. Once I have my ground in, I am going to start drawing the planes, making up the bottom base structure, the largest portion of the cabin. I am tuning out everything else. So the way that I start is I create that vertical that is the closest part of the cabin to us. This corner of the cabin is closest to us. And then we have the two planes receding away. I placed this vertical here because this plane over here is taking up less space than this plane over here where we have the entrance. So I made sure to place this vertical here so that my drawing can fit in the page and I can get approximately similar proportions to what I'm seeing there. Okay, so I'm just gonna start creating the other verticals. So we have another vertical here. All right, so using my visual measuring skills, I'm just gonna take this width, this distance between these two verticals, and ask myself when I see that reference photo, how many times would this distance or this width fit into this width over here for the front plane of this cabin? I would say a little bit more than 2 times, something like that. So I'm going to take this and measure 2 in and then maybe give it a little bit more than that. And I'm not really going for perfect proportions or a perfect replica of what I'm seeing in the reference photo. This is where I'm going to draw my third vertical line. There you go. I have my 3 verticals. Now, usually I make them a little bit longer than I need them. I can erase the sections of these lines that I'm not going to need later on. So now that I have my 3 verticals, I'm going to create the 2 planes. So I'm going to notice this angle that I see in the reference, and I'm just going to try to recreate that to the best of my abilities. And then I'm going to create this angle over here, which is way more steep or pronounced than this angle. Maybe make this a little bit more slanted, tiny bit more. And this is informal perspective practice because I'm not deliberately drawing vanishing points and creating converging lines and anything like that. I am more so taking what I know about perspective and 3D form and combining my knowledge of that essential art fundamental with what I am seeing in the reference photo to create a believable looking structure here. That's going to be my base for my drawing. And remember, this is just the rectangular prism. I am going to be drawing the triangular prism on top of this. This cabin definitely has this base. I'm sure it has a name, but I'm not sure what it's called. A base, right, where we see the rock. So I am tuning that out as I am creating this rectangular prism. I'm going to be adding that in just a bit. I want to close this rectangular prism first. So I'm going to notice this angle at the bottom here, and I'm just going to make it happen as best as I can. Try to really observe the changes in angles in those lines. And then I'm going to draw this other line right here, which is almost a horizontal here in the front. So now we have that base box or rectangular prism that's the largest part of this cabin. If I wanted to add in the rock base portion under the steps and under this cabin, well, all I have to do is just extend this line if it's not long enough already. And you can see how, because the house is on uneven ground, the ground is kind of covering up the edge where the wall meets the ground. Tuning out the steps, I'm not gonna add that in yet because that's a kind of medium-sized structure. So I see something like that. It's not perfect, but there you go. And then over here on this side, the ground is coming up kind of like that. So at this point, I can erase my horizon line. You can see how easily I erase that and how there is nothing left behind because I am drawing lightly. So the base box or rectangular prism is in. I can now start creating the roof, which is a triangular prism. So when it comes to the roof, if we were standing right here in front of this plane of this box, right in the middle and facing forwards towards it in a flat view, we know that usually when it comes to triangular roofs, the topmost part of that triangular section of the roof is gonna be in the middle. However, because of the perspective that we're seeing this house from, it's not really in the middle. It's a little bit back. It's kind of somewhere around here. So I'm just placing a little tick mark so that I can then just do this. Line and line. Remember that it's so important to understand your vantage point in relation with what you're trying to draw. And really observe, because oftentimes our brains are gonna tell us to just go in and draw things a certain way when that's not actually what is happening in the photo or whatever it is that we have in front of us that we're drawing. This is my kneaded eraser, just cleaning things up a bit there. So now I'm gonna close this roof section, and I know that this front triangular roof section where the entrance is covering up lots of that upper edge. But try to use the information that you do have that is present in that photo. Like for example, you can see a little segment of that line here. And you know that it's just a matter of extending it down. Even though there's something that is covering it up here, I'm just extending it and bringing it down so that I can close this shape for this plane here. And I'm gonna make this line slightly less slanted. As I'm going through this, I'm observing my sketch and noticing if there's any issues with perspective and 3D form that I need to fix before moving forward. And that's what I do. I go back, I observe the reference photo and compare and really look at this structure that I'm creating as a whole and asking myself if things are making sense or looking a little bit wonky. And I fix those things and refine my drawing as I go. I have my base structure in, things are looking pretty good, and I can now move on to adding in this adjacent structure here in the entrance. So here, I'm gonna be adding the base first, where the stairs are. And the bottom base of the stairs is really a rectangular prism that is just attached to this one. Let me bring this a little bit more towards the left. It's just a rectangular prism. And of course, this structure is attached to this. So the perspective and the 3D form has to be consistent or it's gonna look wonky. So you've already developed perspective in this. The perspective of this rectangular prism, that's the base for the stairs, has to be the same or it's not gonna look believable. So take into account the lines that you've already developed. So I know it's hard to see because of the rock texture here in the base, but this is what's happening there. We see the front plane and we see a side plane, the same way that we see a front plane here and a side plane here. So that's kind of the base where I'm going to be drawing the steps in just a bit, coming down from there. I think maybe it's a little bit too tall. I'm going to bring it down just a tiny bit. And perhaps I'll bring down this line just a little. Then I'm gonna go in from here so that it's aligned. So now that I have that base structure where the stairs are gonna be, I'm gonna be building on top of this. I see two kind of wooden posts here and here. Notice I'm just starting to lay down lines so that I can visualize this, and then I'll be adding to it, turning these into forms and not lines. But this helps me visualize everything. This back post is somewhere around there. And then the triangular roof, I'm just noticing where the upper point of this goes. It has to kind of cover up this section of the roof. So I have to end it somewhere around here. Just creating tick marks to help me. And I'm gonna start getting in the angle that I see for this edge. And you can use this line that you've already created here as guide. So it starts somewhere around there, and we're able to see the front plane. So if we already have this width established, because you already created your verticals, and you already created a little tick mark over here where you want this point to reach, then all you have to do is draw the triangle there. So I'm noticing that my entrance is more narrow, less wide than the entrance in the reference photo. I'm honestly okay with that. It's perfectly fine. Even though proportions are different, I'm making sure that the structure, the 3D-ness, the perspective looks believable, and that is my objective with the sketch. So I'm just gonna keep going. I'm gonna close this section here with a slant, bring this down to close this plane, and we have this triangular little roof in the entrance. I'm gonna lighten this area, maybe erase some lines that I don't need anymore. And now I'm gonna turn these posts into rectangular prisms. Instead of having a line, I can start creating forms. So these posts are also nothing but rectangular prisms. Long, narrow, rectangular prisms. And you have to ask yourself, what planes of that rectangular prism are you able to see from your current vantage point? I'm starting to hint at the left and right planes of that rectangular prism, so now it's an actual 3D form and no longer a line or just a shape. I'm gonna add in the door now. I wanna make it look like it's in the center here. Maybe it's gonna be partially covered up by this post. Add a line where you want the top edge of your door to be, and then just create a couple of verticals. Here's this vertical, and this other vertical is gonna be behind this post, so we can't really see it. I'm gonna bring this upper edge of the door down a little bit, just because my cabin, I think, proportions-wise, is a little bit taller than the cabin in the photo. So now that this is in, I'm gonna add in the chimney that we can see behind this little roof. As I said before, the chimney really is nothing but another rectangular prism. So we see the front plane. There's this front plane of this rectangular prism. And we have a very slight angle here, and a more pronounced angle here. So remember, this is a structure that is built on the base structure, so the perspective has to make sense. I'm not gonna worry about any more detail in the chimney right now. I'm just gonna get that structure in. The steps are going to be coming out of this structure here, and I'm just going to get in the width where I'm gonna be drawing the step structure. Now the steps come down kind of like this. We can't really see where the bottom step is because there are plants and grasses covering that up. But for me, it's very helpful to visualize where those steps would end. And then once I have this in, it's easier for me to visualize. If I visualize a kind of triangular prism going down like that, then the steps are like a zigzag on this. So I can just do this. Once you have this, let me erase these extra lines so that I can explain this. Once you have this triangular prism here attached in a way that looks believable to this base rectangular prism over here, and you've drawn these lines separating out the steps that you're going to be adding into it, it's really just a matter of zigzagging it. Cut into this a little. And there you go. You can just erase the little sections of the lines here, and there are your steps. Okay, so that's a very quick way of adding believable steps. And I am now going to be moving on to adding windows and also the little rails here. So to begin, when it comes to the windows, we know that windows are usually aligned. So what I like doing for windows when I'm drawing houses and buildings is I create guidelines for myself using the angles that I see in the photo. And I'm going to extend the same line going down like this because I want my windows over on this side to be aligned with the windows over here. And then once I have that in, there are two windows that I want to add. So I have one window here, and I'm just gonna create two verticals. And I have one window here, create two verticals. Then I'm gonna do the same thing for the windows over here. So I want 2 windows, and these windows should look slightly larger or taller than these windows over here because this plane is receding away from us. So perspective tells us that things that are farther away are gonna get smaller and smaller, right? But I'm still gonna use these lines that would eventually converge in a very, very far away vanishing point off to the right of the picture plane. Over on this side, I have just 1 single window. So I'm just gonna draw 1 single window with 2 vertical lines. Now I'm gonna do the same thing on this plane. I'm gonna go like this and like this, noticing the angles that I see there at the bottom of the window shapes in the reference photo. And then I'm gonna use these lines to help me draw the windows. So we have 1 window here, and then we have another window here. The base structure is in, the main elements are in, and now I'm just observing this entire thing, and I am noticing if there's anything that is kind of popping out in terms of 3D form or perspective that I perhaps need to correct before moving forward. Always take some time to observe your drawing before moving on to the next phase of the process, because otherwise, if you move forward without making any corrections, the mistake is just going to snowball into a larger mistake that is going to be more difficult to fix. Okay, so everything is looking okay to me. I am going to erase lines that I no longer need and lighten some sections up, clean my sketch up a little bit more. This is a kneaded eraser, and I can just gently tap it over my graphite work to lighten it. Get rid of any unnecessary graphite that can later just lead to smudging. If we did our job right at this point, adding in the smaller details should be easier to do because we're just using the lines and the shapes that we already have placed. If I wanted to add in detail into the window, I'm really just going to be creating a few parallel lines to the lines that I've already added to create the window frame. And then if I want my window to look like that window in the photo, I'm just going to do a shape there, a shape there, and a shape there. And same thing with these windows over here. I already have this shape. So all I have to do is create lines that are the same as the lines that I've already laid down. Only, of course, the shape that you create with those lines is going to be smaller because it's going to fit inside of that larger shape. But just use the lines that you've already created as guides. And then over here, same thing, only these lines are slanted. So now when it comes to the chimney, if I want to add in a little section here at the top that is a wider rectangular prism, it's just a matter of adding a shorter rectangular prism above this rectangular prism that you've already created that has slightly more width to it. Now, in terms of the roof, I am going to pull the same line down a little bit more and then just wrap it here behind the house. And I'm going to do the same thing here. Pull this line down and just make this shape a little larger. Pull this line a little bit farther away so that it comes out a little bit, and then just complete that line there. Now I can erase this line here, and I've created that illusion of a little section of the roof coming forward. And I can see the bottom plane here for the roof, but I can't really see it over here. Over here I can just see the thickness of it, but I can't really see the underneath plane. And this is because of where we're seeing the cabin from, because of our vantage point. Our vantage point is always going to have a huge impact on the planes that we're seeing and the distortion that we're seeing in those planes. So for the wooden handrails, I'm just noticing those angles, its approximate location in relation with the window here, and I'm just bringing that in and creating that shape there. And then same thing here. I'm just gonna go like this, notice the angle, and then it goes back kind of like that. And then once you have those sections in, you can just add in the bottom and create a few verticals here for the wooden posts, however many wooden posts you'll be adding in. We can also add in that bit of length to the top section here in this triangular wooden portion above the door. Just add some length if you want to make that roof look like it's coming out. In the reference photo, when I zoom in, the door is actually open, but in my drawing, I'm gonna keep the door closed. So I'm just gonna add a little simple handle there. If you wanna use your artistic license and add some spookiness into the drawing and maybe even create some pieces of wood covering up windows and whatnot, feel free to use your artistic license to bring things in. I definitely am. I'm gonna be creating an old dry tree here on the right. And when it comes to drawing dry trees, I just let that shape happen. I start from the bottom and I make my way up and just start by drawing lines, irregular lines, making sure that I have a lot of asymmetry and irregularity present. And also that my branches are more and more tapered, more and more thin as I am making my way out from the central largest tree trunk. Another thing that I want to add is a little fence. And I'm going to make it very imperfect and very irregular. Maybe we can see a little bit more of this fence over here. And of course it's gonna be smaller back here because this is farther away from us. I'm gonna make some of these posts very crooked. Fence comes back here. And then just plants. Gonna create just a path here. You can even add in clouds if you'd like. My sketch is finished. I am now going to be moving on to the pen and ink process. And as you can see, I have left out a lot of detail because I'm going to be adding in that detail directly right away with pen and ink. Before getting started with the pen and ink process, I would highly recommend thinking of the specific types of marks, lines, shapes, and the techniques that you're going to be using to communicate textures, to communicate any dark value areas or shadow areas that you want to create, etc. Because you want to go in with a strategy. Remember, pen and ink is permanent. You're not going to be able to erase your mistakes. So if you need to do any planning or even practice of pen and ink techniques on a separate sheet of paper, I would highly recommend that before adding that into your drawing. So it is time to get started with the pen and ink process. I have many video tutorials on pen and ink tips for beginners, videos on what line weight variation is, why it's so important, and things that you can do to develop a line weight variation in your drawings, and even full tutorials on different types of alternative shading techniques that you can use when drawing with pen. I'm gonna make sure to leave links to those videos down below in the text section of this post, in case you're looking to make progress with your pen and ink drawing and your pen and ink techniques and you'd like more in-depth information on that. But essentially what I do is I first define edges of my different shapes and elements in my drawing, making sure that I'm approaching the definition of those edges in segments, and making sure that I'm moving quickly, swiftly, so that I don't create very rigid, stark looking, stiff lines. And then after I have defined my edges, I start working on selecting and creating marks, for example, that help me communicate the different textures present in my drawing, and even adding darker values. I'm going to start with my definition of edges. I'm really trying to stay away from heavy, stiff looking lines. And whenever I have slight wobbling happening, I just embrace it. I embrace that imperfection because it's better to have an imperfect looking line that has slight wobbles to it, but is more light and dynamic looking than having a perfect, stiff, stark looking line that might be super straight but has stop and start marks and that kind of thing because you're hesitating and you're moving way too slowly. Notice how certain sections of my lines are not even connecting. That really helps me develop line weight variation and helps me stay away from stiffness and flatness in my drawing. And if you're afraid of smudging your drawing, I would recommend, whenever possible, try working from left to right if you're right-handed or right to left if you're left-handed. Of course, there always comes a point in the drawing process where I'm jumping around from section to section, and I could run the risk of just smudging things if I'm not careful, but I'm trying not to rest my hand on my drawing. I'm trying to always have my pinky come into contact with the paper first, and I'm not just pressing down my bottom of my hand on my drawing at any point. I've never really had any issues with smudging with these pigment liners from Staedtler because their ink dries pretty fast, but it's something to just keep in mind. I never force myself to create a single long line from start to finish. I approach the lines in sections or in segments. And I embrace broken lines as well. I'm okay with lines breaking. It helps me create that line weight variation that I'm looking for. All line weight variation means is simply making some sections of your lines and marks thinner and lighter and other sections of your lines and marks thicker and darker. And this is in order to stay away from that flat, cartoony, coloring book page kind of look. Another thing that I'm paying attention to while I'm trying to keep it moving is what shapes are overlapping what shapes. If these wooden pieces are covering up the window, then it's worth me drawing those first or tracing over that pencil work first and then drawing the window shape behind it, because I know I'm not going to be able to erase that line or that shape that I create, and I don't want sections of shapes or edges of shapes to be visible which shouldn't be visible, right? So I have the wooden things in now, and now I can go ahead and trace the shapes for my window. And this way, I can only trace over the sections of my shapes that would actually be visible through the overlapping wood pieces that are covering up the window. Gonna do the same thing here. You can see how with my pen and ink, I'm going in and starting to add more regularity to my shapes that I had previously created with the pencil. Because really, the pencil work that I created is just a guide for me, and now I can be looser and a little bit more free with my pen because I now know I can trust that I am stemming from that foundational sound structure. Pieces of wood first, and then the window shape. Now in this bottom edge, I want to add irregularity to this too, because I have little plants and grasses and things. So I don't want to make this like a smooth edge or a straight line. I want to make these look like plants. Tree trunk. Starting at the base and making my way up towards the smallest branches. I can change the lines and the shapes that I created with my pencil initially if I want to. Notice how I'm still not working on any texture or shading. I'll do that after I finish up with the defining of edges. So here, I'm gonna do first the would-be horizontals, and then I'm gonna do the verticals. Make them crooked. I want this house to look imperfect, to look like it's falling apart. Not spending too long in any single area or with any single element, just keeping it moving. I'm gonna do the fence over here. Would be horizontals first, coming off the picture plane, and quick verticals for the posts. Well, not actual verticals, just would be verticals if this were an actual recently built picket fence. Irregular edges along this path, and I'm incorporating perspective here because this bottom section is wider and it's getting more and more narrow as it's moving away from us and towards the house. All I am missing here in terms of the pencil work that I had already added are the clouds. And we're all done. So as you can see, I haven't added in any shading or any texture or minor detail yet, except for the little plants maybe that are already starting to create a little sense of texture. So this is the part of the process when I'm going to start doing just that. I always leave texture and minor details until the end because texture follows form. So for me, it's very important to establish 3D form and perspective first and make sure that everything looks believable, and then I move on to the minor details. I can do hatching, which I talk all about different alternative shading techniques in that video that I'm going to be linking to down below. If you want to learn how to do hatching, cross hatching, stippling, contour lines, and all that to develop shading, that'll be down below for you. But in a nutshell, all hatching is just straight parallel lines that you place next to each other to cover up more of that paper, and you can start creating a darker value or shadow shape or area. Hatching lines don't have to be going in any specific direction. You can make them straight up and down or at a 45-degree angle, whatever the case may be, but you have to keep that angle consistent once you have chosen it. So I'm just adding a little bit of a darker value with little teeny tiny hatching lines inside the windows there. And I'm also going to start creating a little bit of a irregular rock texture down here in the base of the house, the base structure. So I'm just going in with very abstract kind of rock shapes and making sure that there is a lot of irregularity as I am creating these textures and minor details. Irregularity in every sense of the word, in sizes of shapes and how they're overlapping or grouping together, the shape itself. You want to incorporate a lot of irregularity when the texture requires it. I think that's enough. Overworking is very easy to do when you're working with pen and ink. So I would recommend continuing to come back to see everything as a whole instead of just continuing to add and add and add, and ask yourself if more texture and more detail is actually necessary. When it comes to the tree, I'm just going to create irregular lines here for wood texture, and also in the fence posts, which are made of wood, and especially in the fence post nearest us here. Then I can create some grassy bits here. And even with the grasses, I try to make sure that the blades of grass that I add nearest us are longer than the blades of grass that are farther away to enhance that illusion of depth and perspective. Okay, so I'm gonna add more texture into the house. Create a little bit of texture in the roof. Broken lines here in the roof. Create another line down here. So here we have some vertical pieces of wood. I'm gonna start adding little marks to help communicate the old wood. Little marks over here in the roof. Then there are some little bricks in the chimney. So I'm just gonna add in little marks and rectangular shapes here in a very irregular way. Again, the vertical placement of wood here. And then the wood in these walls is placed more horizontally. I'm gonna do horizontal strokes. Notice how I am making my way from one side all the way towards the opposite edge, skipping over those shapes in between. That really helps me create a consistent line. Sometimes when I fill up one section on the left and fill it up from top to bottom and then work on the other side, what ends up happening is that I create way more lines in one side than in the other side. And also the lines don't look aligned. Notice how I'm embracing the broken lines here, moving fast. I'm gonna add in a little bit of a wood texture and little imperfections in the wood, just with scribbles and marks. Need to add this texture here. Just gonna do horizontals again. I'm gonna continue just adding more marks wherever I want to create different textures, thinking of the texture that I'm looking to describe and picking a mark that I feel will help me do that. And also wherever I want to add shadow, I'm going to be doing some hatching, just parallel lines. I'm gonna stick to hatching. Once I'm nearing the end of the pen and ink process, I like going over certain edges and very lightly doing light scribbles, elongated scribbling motions along some of those sections of the edges of those shapes. And that helps me create not only a heavier visual weight along that edge, but also helps me create a little bit more irregularity and imperfection that can really help me describe the textures that I'm looking for here. Trying to keep my arm and my wrist loose as I'm creating these final marks. Maybe little textures here. Remember that less is more. I don't want to start overworking things and adding way too much. Going over certain edges to add a little bit more irregularity and imperfection. Okay, I'm almost done here. Plants are starting to grow along the bottom of the house here. I added very thin, broken lines in my sky, especially around the house, in order to develop a bit of a darker tone in this area. This is because I wanted to create a little bit more of a nighttime look. And the very last thing that I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be coming back to see everything as a whole. And if there are any edges of elements or shapes that I want to go over in order to make that structure pop out a little bit more towards us, I go ahead and do that. What's cool about developing a line weight variation in a pen and ink drawing is that through using a combination of lighter, thinner lines and thicker, darker lines, you're able to make your drawing look a lot more interesting and a lot more 3D. Bolder lines are going to pop out to the viewer, while thinner, lighter lines are going to recede or look like they are farther away. If I continue adding too much, I might run the risk of overworking things, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to leave my pen and ink old cabin sketch at that. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did, and if so, make sure to check out everything that I am offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you're going to get immediate access to my exclusive tutorials, classes, and resources that I don't share anywhere else. All of these exclusive tutorials include my downloadable outline sketches so that you don't have to start from scratch, reference photos, and my supply lists. There's already a library of over 75 sketching and watercolor painting tutorials that are real-time, meaning they are not sped up or edited, they are fully narrated, and I take you through my entire process, making sure to explain everything as clearly as possible, step by step. 2 new exclusive full-length tutorials are added into this exclusive library every single month. For those of you who are interested in really taking your artwork to the next level and want to know all of the inside secrets that I learned about in art school and courses that I've invested in myself, there's also a full library on classes on art fundamentals in which all of the bases are covered. That library has now over 35 classes and workshops. All have assignments at the end that help you actually put your knowledge to the test. And there's a brand new class or workshop added at the beginning of every single month. As if all of this weren't enough, you also get a weekly sketchbook prompt sent to your inbox to help you stay consistent with your art practice. There's a live training, workshop, or paint-along session with me every single month. Members in the $15 tier and upwards get access to thorough feedback from me on their work whenever they need it, and much more. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, which you can choose from depending on your goals and needs. So go ahead and check it out. I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can find out more down below in the description box of this video. And I would love to get to know more about you and your work and have you join this innermost art community of mine. Alright you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys!